It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
Having that Yanship line extended and completed last year certainly had an impact as well, because you can see people who, again, work in the CBD but can't afford to buy their first property or their second property close to the CBD are looking at that as a much more viable option of moving out to Alkimos or to Butler.
And that is Dan Maccora on the Real Estate Breakfast this morning, as we welcome you back to more property news and information from around Australia, from Cairns to Perth and Noosa to Melbourne suburb of Carlton. And good morning to wherever too you might be listening to us from. Perhaps you're in the car driving this morning, maybe in the gym, or you might be walking around your local suburb, because we know that is what you do every morning, Nikki, in Adelaide. How do we know? Well, you emailed in to tell us that you've been listening for the last 12 months. Thank you for that. And you're hoping to buy your first property in the next few months and wanted to share your own personal story with the First Home Buyers Scheme that kicked in on the 1st of this month. Now, while you can get more of a mortgage, and your mortgage broker, you say, has been super helpful, you don't want to overcommit to a larger borrowing scenario, because you say you are on your own, you're in your 40s with no backstop, and it could just take one event to severely cripple you financially, and that's of concern. And you hate the fact that you would only be putting down 5%, which enables you to get into the market straight away. But there is a lot of procrastination going on as you ponder, you say, and weigh up the final solution and outcome. You ask the question, am I overthinking all of this? Well, I've got to say, every situation is different, Nikki. Yes, there will be people, as they listen to your story, saying, just get into the property market. And I understand that sentiment, and Nikki, you probably do as well. But my experience with watching other people procrastinate, it's always going to cost them money. Thankfully, I don't suffer from that. When something feels right, I just go for it. So my suggestion is make a decision sooner rather than later to save time and money, and also the stress that is going to be weighing you down. Nikki, let us know what you do finally decide to do, and thank you so much for taking the time to send that email to us. If you've got some thoughts with regard to Nikki, or you want to share your own situation, our email address is myrealestatepodcast@gmail.com. Well, it's a Thursday morning, October the 23rd. Let's go to Perth right now and catch up with Dan Maccora. He is from Saville, Inspiring Real Estate. And good morning to you, Dan. Welcome into the Real Estate Breakfast. I guess you'd have a few comments about Nikki there in Adelaide, just sort of weighing the pros and the cons up.
Yeah, good morning, Craig. Thanks for having me on the show. And certainly if that isn't just an echoing sentiment across all of the nation, I think amongst buyers, especially the first home buyers who are looking to capitalise on these government incentives, we can totally understand that they're searching for properties and they've been looking for potentially 3 or 4 years and just watching the market climb, usually in most cases faster than they're trying to sell, than they're able to save. And so that's where this procrastination can certainly creep in, because the fear that potentially making an incorrect financial decision and not having a backstop, as Nikki explains, can definitely create some reasonable fears. But at the same time, they're watching markets creep up faster than they can save. So I believe the goal of this is to help people get into the market sooner and get in front of that increase and hopefully build some equity and get on that property ladder. And it is difficult for people when they're up against investors or second home buyers who are capitalising on equity. And we've heard stories of investors and seen it ourselves, where those second home buyers or investors who have slightly better leveraging and better financial positions just offer slightly above the government incentive cap, which helps them to grab properties. So my thoughts would echo yours, Craig, that if you can afford to, and if buying a property is very high on your priority list, then jumping in sooner rather than later can be helpful, because then you're getting ahead of that potential growth that we're hearing a lot of economists speak about.
Yes, exactly right. And sometimes it's a little bit like these people that are cliff diving into the ocean. Sometimes you've just got to sort of take that leap of faith, but always make sure that there's no rocks poking out from down below. Now, house prices often drop the further you travel from the city along train lines. This is something we want to talk about this morning. Suburbs deeper down the line are usually more affordable due to longer commutes and distance from major employment hubs. PropTrack reported that desirable schools, beaches and lifestyle amenities, they can create exceptions between neighbouring stops. But try this on for size. In Melbourne, buyers can save $1.1 million by choosing Caulfield over nearby Malvern, or $923,000 by opting for Box Hill instead of Mont Albert. So there's quite a big difference in these neighbourhoods. And if we take a look at Perth, Dan, where you are, Stirling and Warwick have a difference of around $450,000 in their median sale price. So perhaps just step over what's going on with these price variations where you are and what is causing the big price differences in those suburbs.
Yeah, so you're certainly correct in that the further north we go, you do see a trend that, or the further south, you do tend to see a trend as we progress away from the CBD, you see property prices becoming more affordable for buyers. And that is undoubtedly linked to factors like commutes for work and people working in CBDs. However, it's definitely not the only factor which would affect that pricing. And we see public amenities being one key factor. Affordability levels in general can sometimes help different suburbs. And also, I think it's important to note when you're looking at a median sale price to be wary of what the median property is within a suburb, because typically you can see that some suburbs have predominantly apartment style buildings, or you have more unit styles, or simply a higher density of 3x1s even on full size blocks, whereby that would somewhat artificially affect the median sale price. What we do see is exactly as the piece states, that the further north you go, the more affordability you see.
Are you noticing stronger demand pushing further north with, say, more buyers now targeting the more affordable suburbs further along the train lines?
Yeah, that is a sentiment we're seeing largely. I've been in the career for 8.5 years now, and typically further northern suburbs, you would see slightly lower demand. However, those areas in the far north of Perth, sort of around Alkimos and even as far as Yanchep, are now getting quite consistent levels of demand. And that speaks to the affordability. And I think with areas such as Alkimos and Butler, they're also much newer properties because they're newer developments. And so we're actually seeing, from an investor perspective, first home buyers and downsizers all seeing a lot of value in those newer properties, which are lower maintenance, especially when you look at the cost of building and the timeframes around building at the moment. And then seeing them as a much more valid and reasonable area to move to. Speaking to the public transport item, having that Yanchep line extended and completed last year certainly had an impact as well, because you can see people who, again, work in the CBD but can't afford to buy their first property or their second property close to the CBD are looking at that as a much more viable option of moving out to Alkimos or to Butler or even to Yanchep, where you now have a train line accessing those areas and making the morning commute much more palatable.
And we are talking to Dan Maccora. He is in Perth. We're talking local train lines. We'll come back with more after this.
We help to break down real estate every day to help you better understand the Australian property market.
And I want to circle back to something we were talking about yesterday, and that was off-market sales. There could be an argument that because you're in an exclusive area, that, you know, these high price tags, some people, they absolutely cherish their privacy. Is this a case of maybe saying, well, yes, an off-market suits us, although I still stick with it. It's not mass marketing and you're probably not going to get the best price.
I think that if you look at off-market versus on-market, look, at the very, very high end, off-market does seem to be kind of a growing trend where, you know, these properties that are trading at 30, 40, 50 million and beyond are selling very discreetly and quietly. However, if we're talking more broadly, I tend to think that, you know, as an owner, and the agent, how can you have conviction that you are achieving the maximum price when you've only had a couple of people through and then receive an offer? You don't have enough information to substantiate that. One thing I will say, though, is that I think off-market has a place in a campaign and a process. And that's usually leading into, the formalized approach, or as you've said, mass marketing. So you're bringing through some key people who have the right capacity and right criteria before starting the campaign, because then that provides you with a lot of momentum leading into that process. But I think just selling off market in isolation doesn't really yield the urgency and doesn't really provide enough information to substantiate that you're achieving the maximum.
Eager to expand your property expertise? Enhance your real estate know-how with us.
And it is a Real Estate Thursday. We're talking train lines. I forgot to mention in Sydney, buyers can save big by crossing the Georges River, with Como offering houses nearly $750,000 cheaper than neighbouring Oatley, despite being just one train stop and 3 minutes apart. That's almost insane, isn't it? We're back with Dan. He is in Perth, and just sticking with us for a little bit longer, how big of a role does public transport access, particularly being close to a train station, really play in shaping buyer demand and property prices in Perth's northern corridor, which, it's got to be said, is heating up?
Yeah, it certainly does play a factor for many buyers, and also typically investors and developers as well, because I'm not sure how this stacks up interstate. However, I think it would echo Perth. A lot of the areas that are set and planned for rezoning are close to main public transport areas. And so you do see developers and investors looking at those spaces and having a look at the community planning guidelines and purchasing in them ahead of potential rezoning. And then also layering on top of that the general commute incentives and those sorts of things being associated with the access to public transport. Another element, I think, as well, is that when we're speaking with buyers, is that they say that being close to the train line in Perth therefore means that you're close to the freeway and typically other main arterial roads. So those sorts of factors, those factors of having access to the freeway, whether you're driving or going through to the train stations, certainly makes the commute more easy and increases buyers' flexibility when they're looking to move further north.
We call it metrification. So, yeah, if you can get on very close to those train lines and you buy in at the right price, things are looking pretty good. Now, talking of good, we're running up to Christmas, not that far away. What do you think for the Perth property market there, Dan? How do you think you're going to fare between now and Christmas?
Yeah, I think that things aren't going to be slowing down, especially since the government incentives are pulled forwards. We're just seeing that there are a few more properties cropping up on the market. However, with demand being so strong, they're being soaked up by that buyer demand. And we're still seeing record lows in Perth and I believe across the country in listing numbers. So given that population growth in Perth and WA as a whole is so significant and building is still so slow comparatively and quite expensive, I think that the demand for existing housing is going to remain strong, and we're probably going to still see increases toward the end of the year.
All right, then. Well, we'll wrap it up there. I know that you're going to be busy over the Christmas New Year. You've got a newborn, a couple of children under the age of 5. That'll keep you busy.
Yeah, it certainly will. It has for the last 3 years.
Thanks for coming on to the Real Estate Breakfast, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Craig. It's been a pleasure.
Decode the property market with insider knowledge and insights to better navigate your real estate journey.
Unlike residential, commercial property values is largely driven by lease quality, the tenant's financial strength. You've got to look at that. Got to look at the lease length and the rent review terms. I mean, they're all very, very important.
Yes, it certainly is. I think we've definitely seen an influx of buyers, particularly across Australia, really pushing towards tenant quality, particularly in the last 5 years. So right now, if you're an investor and you're looking for tenant quality, you might have to settle for a little bit sharper return or yield because the asset is so tightly held and sought after. Whereas if you're looking for maybe a less desirable asset class to the majority of the market right now, like office or short-term leased older industrial stock, your yields and your return on investment might be a little bit higher each year, but the security is probably a little less.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.